Well, we'll start off because it is a live stream presentation starting at 6 as well. So kia ora, nau mai, haere mai, and good evening. And on behalf of the Gisborne District Council, I'd just like to welcome you all here tonight. And thank you for joining us either here in the chambers or for those who are watching online for this presentation and Q&A discussion regarding Let's Talk rates. So tonight we're going to share with you why the Gisborne District Council has reviewed the rating system, what changes are being proposed, what those changes are, and then how those changes would impact ratepayers across the region if they're adapted. We'll then discuss specifically with you, the proposed change to the targeted rate that currently exists at Wainui Beach, followed by time for Q&As. I do urge each of you, both here and online, if you haven't done so already, there is a website on the council webpage called Let's Talk Rates. And head there, we've created a rates tool so you can put in your property address and that will show you what the impact of all of these proposed changes would be to your specific property, comparing it to your 2020-2019 rates. Some rates for ratepayers will go up and some will go down, and whether you're in the up or the down category, we really want to hear your feedback of whether you like that or not, because the feedback through the submissions process is what goes in front of the councillors to help with their decisions in terms of adapting these changes or not. We do have computers here, some tablets and a few PCs. So if you haven't had the opportunity and would like to make a submission at the end of the presentation this evening, certainly grab one and we can do that before you head home for your evening. You right? Okay. So before we start the presentation, I'd just like to invite Ree here to say mihi. Kia ora. Thank you, Ree. So tonight, with us from council here, I'll just introduce the team. We have from the Revenue and Finance team, here is Pauline Foreman, the Chief Financial Officer. Over to the side, we have Fiona Scragg, the Revenue Team Leader, and she probably welcomed you on the way in, as Louise Carlisle, who will be joining us, Senior Systems Accountant. Familiar face to some of you at Wainui, Dave Wilson, Director of Community Lifelines, and also Joe Noble from Strategic Planning, and my name's Kyla and I'm the facilitator this evening. And we have Nadine Thatcher-Swan, who's the Chief Executive Officer, and Tony Robinson, Councillor. So as I mentioned, at the end of the presentation, we'll have time for Q&As and to ensure those on the live stream, if you have a question you would like to ask, please use this email address. We'll be monitoring the email and we'll have an opportunity from one of the team members to respond, or if you leave this evening and suddenly have that burning question, anyone in the room, please use this email address too, so one of the team members can get back to you with a reply. So you're probably wondering what the heck, why the need for the review and these proposed changes. And essentially there's been two key aspects that have prompted the review. One has been feedback from the community in terms of how rates are being allocated. And the other one is it does form a part of the council's long-term planning process. A bit small to read, I apologise, but it really does just highlight it's not something that happens overnight. There's been many months of work put into reviewing the process, And during that review, it's taken on board many different considerations, such as looking at who's paying, identified possible options, and then considered those changes and modelled those impacts to see what a group of ratepayers, it changes to property rates. Now, as this review's been progressing, it began in 2019. As the review's been progressing, there have been themes that then started to percolate up and emerge, and the changes being proposed is relating to those themes. So enough of me talking. I'll now hand you over to the team, to Pauline and Joe, to take you through the proposals.
So as we just mentioned by Kyla, we're required by law to every 3 years do a review of the way we fund activities. In this particular review, we went back to basics. It actually is a principle-led review, and it also was trying to have the alignment with our Te plan and looked at as our overall strategic objectives. Some of the principles that we identified from this process was that all funding options should consider affordability, that funding choices will support the outcomes of Te Rāwhiti 250, each generation should pay for the services that they receive, that the revenue collection should be obvious, transparent, efficient, and simple and consistent. There's another of other ones, but those are some of the lines up there. It was identified that there were areas within the current rating system that was no longer fit for purpose, and it didn't align to some of these new principles, and there were other inconsistencies with our rates. So the review showed that there were 3 main issues. The first issue was the principle of affordability, or the ability to pay rates. Effectively, the current rating system has a high proportion of fixed rates. That means that everybody pays the same amount. That impacts the low-income households, obviously more than higher income households. And when we're talking about that, it has no regard with the ability to pay rates. The second issue was the road maintenance and who should pay. Currently, the level of the forest harvesting and increased uses of heavy vehicles on our roading network means that council is putting a lot more of our roading budget on repairing and renewing the roads used by the forestry sector more than what it used to. And the last issue was looking at the infrastructure maintenance and who should pay. When we refer to the infrastructure maintenance, in this particular case, we're talking about water supply, wastewater, and stormwater. And just the stormwater, just to give a greater definition, it's the water that runs off impervious or water-resistant surfaces such as your roads, such as your roofs, your driveways, and the footpaths. And those runoffs goes into stormwater pipes or channels that carries out to the nearest waterway. So we're proposing 5 main changes in how we allocate rates. It should be noted that we actually doesn't mean that we collect more rates. It just means we collect the same amount, but it's the reallocation of how it's across all ratepayers. So the first one, we're talking about general rate. We are proposing that all ratepayers contribute to the cost of infrastructure of 3 waters and coastal maintenance through the general rate. With the general rate, obviously, every ratepayer pays. This is opposed to a targeted rate, which targets a group of ratepayers. The cost for these activities across all the ratepayers support the low-income households' ability to pay rates, and it's consistent with another number of activities where the benefit is actually across the whole community. The current rating system actually doesn't recognise the benefit provided to the whole community by the delivery of the free waters infrastructure. These benefits relate to improving and maintaining the water quality, protecting water bodies, coastal water that have important ecosystem, the recreation and cultural activities, and moving more towards the sustainable use of fresh water. This recognition of the benefits is also supported by the government recent water reforms of how water, our emphasis on who should be managed and who's going to be provided to all communities. The main changes with it, the proposal, is actually looking at saving for most of the infrastructure is a 10% part of the general rate across for all three of those. Currently, stormwater, there is a 20%, but we're saying for consistency, there's a 10%. In the other areas, as we've sort of touched on, it's the way that we're roading rates for the forestry sector, changing how we allocate for collected the wastewater system, and this particular ones won't affect those ones at Wainui. It is only within the others reticulated to the services. And also the other stormwater rates and removing the city centre management and promotion. So in this particular one here is just to show that there is a redistribution or the reallocation of some of those decisions. And with it, you can see from the change in the roading rate that the forestry sector is going to pay more, and that's going up in that area. The other side of that is that residential areas will go down. Currently, what is happening is effectively the amount that we need for the forestry damage on the roads is being subsidised by the residential ratepayer. So that is why there's a bit of a reallocation, and most of that reallocation there. Then there's a slight change within the commercial industrial area from the way that we're changing the rates for wastewater on those reticulated, and again in the horticulture and pastoral, probably from the general rate. So we've touched on some of the general rate proposed changes, but what we want to talk about to you tonight more is what do those relate to specifically to Wainui. We've identified within the rating system that are currently the Wainui coastal maintenance rates is obviously a targeted rate, and it's targeted to you as a group of ratepayers. Yet there is wider community benefits from coastal maintenance activities. So the proposal is to remove the targeted rate and put the cost of managing and maintaining the coastal maintenance rates into the general rate, so that all ratepayers will contribute like we do for rivers and for flood protection. This proposed change will see the removal of the current Wainui 4-June rate, reducing rates for yours, which is 114 ratepayers properties, I should say. Pass over to Jo.
Kia ora tātou. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about that Wainui targeted rate that's for the Coastal Erosion Protection Scheme. So as some of you or all of you may be aware, the rate was originally set up in 2000-2001. It was originally intended to be a one-off, but then it was continued, led to a management committee being formed, and the first Wainui Beach Erosion Management Strategy being finalised in 2003. And we've since had a replacement in 2014. As you know, the council owns and maintains a number of existing structures along the Wainui Beach coastline from Tuahini Point to Hamanatua Stream, and that's a mix of groins, there's some rock walls, and there's some gabion baskets. There's those sort of mesh baskets filled with stones, and those structures are in various states of condition and repair, but they do provide protection, at least to some extent, to private properties, coastal access ways, and the reserve land. The strategy does note that some of those structures don't serve necessarily a particularly useful role other than psychological. And the way that we look after the structures at the moment is guided by the Wainui Beach Erosion Management Strategy. And the current version has been in place, like I said, since 2014. As you're probably aware, the current strategy recommends a range of actions, including things like updating the current set of rules and policies that we have about how we manage coastal hazards in our Tairawhiti Resource Management Plan. And Council's just undergoing a big exercise to scope out how to go about updating that plan, which is a massive job for the Council. Also dune restoration, dune planting, reforming dunes after storm events. A new rock wall at Tuahini is signalled in the strategy, and also maintenance of existing assets and removal of unsafe components. And then in the long term, the strategy talks about managed retreat and potential removal of erosion protection structures and relocation of houses and assets. So the targeted rate was intended to fund works associated with maintaining those existing structures, but also building that new rock wall at Tuahini. And as you're probably all aware, unfortunately, despite 2 resource consent processes and applications, Council was unable to obtain resource consent for that new structure. In this slide, I'm hoping you can see the graphs, but I'll talk you through them. If not, it just shows how much has been collected over time from that targeted rate versus what's been spent by Council on activities at Wainui Beach. So overall, the story is that more has been spent by Council on maintenance and preparing those consent applications and doing investigations and research than has been collected in the targeted rate. So that's that top left graph. The red is what's been spent over time, and the blue is what's been collected in rates over time. And then the graph in the bottom corner shows that expenditure, total expenditure in green going up over time, and that's split into maintenance and also the cost spent on what we call special projects, which includes things like those consent applications. So that maintenance cost has been fairly steady over time, that's the blue line, but there was a sharp rise in the amounts spent on special projects, and that reflects the sort of time and effort that went into trying to obtain those resource consent applications. Some were successful for like the stream works coming up to a groin, but the new rock wall at Tuahini was not. So the overall message is the maintenance spend has been fairly steady, and we can project what that's likely to be in the future over the short term, but implementing some aspects of that current strategy have not been straightforward. So we know we probably need to go back and refresh that strategy and take another look at it, and also the policies and rules that we have in the Tairāwhiti Resource Management Plan, which guides how decisions are made on resource consents. But while we're waiting to update those important documents, which has to be done in consultation with the community, we will continue to do those repairs to the existing structures and removing hazards, and also supporting dune restoration and planting. And this is a sort of summary of what Pauline has touched on, a bit more detail about why we're proposing to change from a targeted rate and move into the general rate. I'm not quite sure what's happened to my arrow on the screen. Apologies. So the team at Council have looked at the forward work programme, and it's indicating that the future budget needed per year, at least in the short term, is probably less than $10,000 per year. As Pauline mentioned, there are wider community benefits to maintaining Wainui Beach. It's a highly valued area, there's reserve land. Lots of people come and use Wainui, not just the Wainui residents. So that's an argument for moving the costs into the general rate rather than having those 114 property owners pay. And obviously it will mean a reduced rate for those Wainui properties. The amount of money we're intending to collect, sort of less than $10,000, it doesn't really make it efficient to collect via a separate targeted rate. It's far simpler and more efficient to collect via a general rate. And it also separates out that routine management of coastal erosion from special projects and new structures, which we would be a separate budget with a separate funding stream. And I'll just come to that now. So what does it mean for the future? So Council has undertaken an initial stock take of where we're at with that current strategy, and that recommends that a refresh is undertaken. So we will need the community's input on doing that. I can't tell you exactly when that will occur yet, but we will be talking to the community. It's not something that Council's going to go away and write and then say, hey, look what we've done. And alongside that is the refresh, the rewrite of the Tairāwhiti Resource Management Plan, which has those rules and policies that really are key when it comes to consent applications. So, and if in the future, Council and the community decide that additional coastal work is needed, whether that be new structures or more dune restoration, sand scraping, whatever that may look like, and more funding is needed, then we'll come back, talk to the community about funding options, which could include a targeted rate for some Wainui residents. Back to Pauline.
So while we also talk about already out there, I'll do it again, my apologies. There are a number of rates that actually have a general rate. And it's mostly on the flood control and the rivers asset management. And they have different percentages based on sort of the general public good associated with it. And what it's saying that, so for example, that the flood control, it's been recognised that why those that are closest to the flood control protection assets have the greatest benefit is a recognition that those wider out in the community is an economic benefit for everybody. So those are the kind of the assets we have, the rates that are general applied. We have a number of other rates that are applied, which are called uniform annual charge, which means fixed rates for every single property. And that applies in a simple manner where it's recognised that there's a kind of a public good for all.
That's the end of the presentation. I'll now hand over to the floor for questions, feedback, thoughts. I will bring a microphone to you just so those online can also hear the questions being asked. So I'd like to invite anyone who might like to have something to say or ask one of the team a question. Do you want to go back to the graph?
Inception.
So in terms I think that's up at so operation was about 900K, I think that is up there. It goes up to about 700 at the top rate, which comes into effect at the end also for this year. That's taking into account the amounts of rates already included, and that's the red line, which is just above that 700K line.
That's the total that we've collected.
Yes.
Since
the start.
That's cost.
Yes.
That's 700.
That's 700.
You've got about, no, rates is about 600.
So in terms of that, you can see it's a little bit hard, and I'll try and do it on this. Where's the arrow? No. All right. So in terms of that line that you've got, in the earlier stages, the red line is the actual cost. That's actually, okay. Usually, so yeah. So essentially, in the early stages, the actual maintenance cost is up until about 2017. I think it was about, on average, 15K of maintenance. Okay, and that was the sort of the levels that we had, ups and downs. And the other graph, which you can't see, is on the bottom, but basically it's got a green line which says the total cost, and then there's a middle maintenance line which is about that 15K. There was some higher levels in some of the other years, but it was around between 10 and 15. Yeah.
So the emergency works are not included in these costs. So that's funded from a different stream. I'll ask Pauline how that's funded.
That will be, yes.
So that's sort of
Is it emergency that how it operates in terms of the other things when there are costs that occurs? Yeah, depending on the overall and the assessments that needs to be done and the engineers, but they.
It was very much for that event, we had to act for a valid reason. We had an environmental concern for it. Doesn't mean we're going to do that every time. So just want to make sure that's clear. When it comes to the maintenance, we all know we can't get consent to do some of the works that we traditionally would have done. So those gabion baskets, a lot of the works that are required now along there, we can't get consent to do any of that work, and we need to review the beach management strategy so that we can get consent to do that. So when we talk about what we've done in the past and what we can do in the future, there's no point collecting a rate for something that we're not able to do as council staff.
So you're saying that you're actually changing your approach as of now?
It's been this way for a while though. I mean, we know those gabions, for example, we haven't been able to do maintenance on those because they're already falling apart. We're running out of things that we can do along there that we can actually get a consent to undertake works now.
So the letter that came out said that consents had been rejected or unable to be obtained. Which consents were knocked back?
So Gray, that's the consents that were done about 2.5 years ago. If you remember, that was the sand push-ups. It was the works on the Tuahini wall that we wanted to undertake to repair those as well. Those are the ones that we weren't able to get resource consent to do because the commissioner at the time said they were inconsistent with the New Zealand coastal policy statement, so we weren't able to get consent to undertake that work.
The idea to change the rating system now, even before the policy has come out again, and what we may or may not be able to do in the future, we're just deciding to lump it back into the general rating system.
It's around the general rating system, picking up for the maintenance that we can do, given that the benefits
for
for
a
all.
Specific targeted rate at this stage.
Yeah. So for the targeted rate at this stage, we're not undertaking targeted works along that beach because we're unable to.
Right.
So what we're saying is until we figure out what we can rate for, we will then come back with what those options are with the community as we develop that beach management strategy and say, if we're able to undertake these type of works, who pays as part of that discussion going forward. But as of right now, there's not work that the team are able to do because we don't have consents in place to be able to do that work.
Maintenance is consented though.
For the maintenance, the routine stuff, so where we can repair the gabions or if we're repairing some of the assets that we have there, we do have that, which is why we've got that budget set inside the general rate to pay for that stuff. So we have something there for that. And as we said, emergency works is something different again. So we still have that there. It's around, we can't do some of the stuff that was in the strategy that we're rating you for now through that targeted rate.
Sure, but the big spend through and use of the targeted rates has been consultants and consultation and wordy as opposed to hard work. So if we're going to go into the general fund, it's just going to disappear, and then we'll be in line with everyone else with the flood protection and with no specific. This is what we've spent, or this is what we've put towards work in this specific area.
So the way that it works is it's funded by general rates. We have a line item within our budgets that's for Wainui beach maintenance. So that's a line item in there for coastal protection works, similar to how it is for our flood control schemes and those things. And we report our spends against that individual line item.
Yes.
So we can track what's been spent.
Transparency historically on what that spend has been. In fact, when we did try to check it down, there was hands in the air, we've got no idea. And that's from council staff. So the fact that we're going to try and do this now through the transparency to see if the general spend is a little bit concerning.
So just with that, we can track it, and we can.
I've seen the numbers, and I can't work out why we've got some of the spend items.
So in terms of it, we would be tracking it. We can track it. We have the ability
Going forward.
We definitely,
I understand that.
Yeah.
This is forensic, historic stuff, trying to work out where the cost would be, and it's smoke and mirrors, really. And you know, I'm questioning your collection figures as well. 10K, is that what we were talking about for the special targeted fund?
So we're saying going forward,
Well, let's say in the last 2 years, not even going forward, what we're deciding to put into the general pocket.
so there's two things. The graph up there is actually what is incurred. You can't,
Yep.
apologies for the graph, so you can't see it.
Right?
But each year you can see the increases that go up, and there is a line that sort of goes up there for the maintenance ones, and those are going up increments of around about 10 to 15 Ks. And that's what we're saying, that's about the level that we need for maintenance going forward. There's another one that goes a bit of a zigzag, which is at the bottom, which was the for resource consents and for the investigation and those kind of things, which we're saying we can't do that going forward, but we can actually show it. We can show every single last cent
Sure.
of it.
What, as a ratepayer out there, the targeted rate would be 10% of that gather every year, and have been since Cook County Council days on the specific cost to the targeted rate. So I'm questioning your 10K collection a year.
So this is what, so for 114 people,
Yep.
and if you've got, say, like an average, if you've got about 10 to 15,000, which it was about $1,100 per annum in rates for it. And people go more or less depending on how close they are to the beach,
Yep.
what the value of the property. So that's the quantum that you're talking about. In the last couple of years, we were trying to phase it because we knew that there was some resource consent in there, and that was around about 45K, which is why you had a little bit more steeper in the last
Yep.
couple of years. But that's the quantum of per annum
Of
that has been,
collection.
yes, a collection and the work that is done and from beginning of the inception, I should say.
The worry about going into the general fund is that it's much harder to argue it's for the good of the community, because often it will be possibly for the good of a couple of people that live near the works. So it makes us feel a little bit more threatened sometimes, I think.
And some of the things with it, so we take it back to probably the closest you're going to get for the examples of what we actually currently have is the flood control protection. And so those obviously closest to that flood control are going to get the best benefit, and they're the assets that got associated with it. But when it comes back beyond that, there's a wider benefit to the community for doing for the overall. The reason why two things is that you say that it's better to go on the general rate because the value now is quite lower, and so it doesn't actually, the cost of maintenance when we're talking about efficiency and effectiveness, and the cost of actually imposing that is going to be more than we're actually trying to collect from the group of people, and we can do that in other ways. So when I was giving you the examples of the general rate, we do have that, and we do that, and it's definitely with the flood control protection.
Sure, but the Wainui residents, we're subsidising to a certain extent because we are paying for water supply, wastewater removal and stormwater control, and we don't have any of that.
Yeah, so that's the second question. So the first part is a little bit of the general rate, which is regarding to your specific targeted rate now, which we're saying, okay, that's going to be a little bit of a change. And then the next part of the kind of the conversation is, okay, if we're looking at to change a little bit more of the 10%, and we say, okay, what is that impact of that? And is there a direct relationship to what are the services I haven't? And you can say, okay, we provide our own, so therefore, why do we need to contribute to the rest? And that's the argument of, is there elements of this rate that there are public good components that is actually not all attributed to those persons that are directly receiving their reticulated services. And we were talking about the ecosystems, the environment, how does that relate? And then they were saying, how do we get that consistency against those three infrastructure rates where currently you have stormwater, which is at 20%, everybody pays 20%. We say, well, we'll reduce that down and have that consistency for 10 for the water supply and 10 for wastewater. But in terms of those kind of things and your input into it, certainly would welcome with the submissions that come through as an overall discussion as well.
So I don't think anyone's against paying for the things as long as the system works as a community. And we're obviously still struggling, both waste and stormwater in this town at the moment. And with the increase out towards us with hard surfaces increasing at the rate they are in problem areas such as Sponge Bay, I don't see a problem in paying it as long as we're getting a result. So yeah, that'll be part of the submission up front for sure.
You said before how difficult it was for council to get resource consent to do certain projects at Wainui. Does that affect council itself then for trying to maintain its own assets out there? For instance, the stock route footpath access down onto the beach. You would then have to, I presume, apply for a consent yourself to do the remedial work there to fix that up. Is that a problem?
100%. So that's where the separation in council powers comes across. So we're the consent applicant in my area, whereas regulatory, we have to apply to them for consents like everybody else does. So the big issue we have why we can't do work at the moment is because we can't get consent for it. So Stockies, we've got an issue there around looking at what consents we need to get in place for there. We have a similar problem down at Tuahini with the wall there. So we're subject to the same consents, but it's also why we're unable to take a lot of the work that we would had in our plan for South Wainui, because we haven't got consent to be able to do that work.
Although, because that surely is one place where you could deem that the public good that's done by that is, you know, for a major footpath access, but you'd fly in for getting consent to fix that up. It's a disgrace what's down there.
Oh, look, we're just subject to the same things. If you're trying to do something at home, I've got to get a resource consent just like you do, even though I'm doing council work. And it's just that separation between the two. So it's in the coastal hazard zone. We've got to look and see what we're able to do. We've got to be compliant with the Resource Management Act, just like anybody else does.
It's concerning that we have climate emergency happening at the moment, and you know, you're talking about having reviewing plans and refreshing strategies. So what's the process for the reviewing of the plans that are going to be needed, knowing that we've only got 10 years, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to pull back? Otherwise, it's going to be too late. So what's our big strategy here to really protect our communities and make them safe?
So there's no easy answer. So what we're doing at the moment is scoping exactly what work is needed, what resources ideally are required, and then we'll have to look at what council can afford and what the ratepayers can afford to really start that work in earnest, probably from next year onwards. So initial work's happening now, because changing and updating those Resource Management Act plans, it's not a simple process. There are statutory requirements you have to meet. There's engagement you have to go through. There's submissions, further submissions, hearings. But you know, it's something that council knows it has to do, and it's already made a commitment to do that. And we have to take into account climate change as part of that process.
Well, you know, being driven by climate change, climate emergency. At the hearing that we went to, whenever that was, for the emergency works, we were told then that there was a reviewing, a scoping of a review. Is that part of this process?
Yeah.
And if so, then what is the time frame? Because I know everything takes forever. You know, it's taking us forever to get a consent. But you know, it's dire, and we need to be acting really quickly and transparently and effectively. So how can we, as a community, knowing the constraints that you guys are under, obviously, that you can't get resource consent. So, you know, really, what's the approach? Because we need one, and we need it desperately.
So In terms of certainty about the resourcing available and what we have to work with, that comes through the long-term plan. So early engagement is underway on that at the moment, and we'll have a much clearer picture once that plan is adopted in June next year. So we'll know clearly what the priorities are once council's made its decisions after hearing from the community, and also how it's chosen to allocate the money that it receives from ratepayers. So that will clearly set the forward work programme for council. So we'll have a much clearer picture then on when we'll be coming to the community on these issues.
June 2021.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that nothing's happening in the interim.
Yeah. So
But
it would be
that's when
good,
it's
so it'd be
much
good to know what is
clearer.
happening in the interim. I mean, you know, it just feels that there's a whole vacuum and we're not kept up to date with what's going on. You know, we need to have everybody behind, you know, policy and that's going to work for everybody.
Yeah, so if you've seen any of that early engagement discussion as part of the long-term plan, that gives you an idea of some of those questions that council is grappling with about where to put its focus. So I'd really urge you to look at the website and check out those conversations, because it's asking for feedback to help council prioritise where it puts its effort over the next 10 years. There's also climate change work going underway, developing sort of our interim action plan before we do more detailed risk assessment and planning, because never a one-stop shop. You have to go back and revisit, collect more data, talk to the community and refine your plan as you go.
Yeah, so we come back to this whole question of constraints of resource, of consents, and if you can't get them, you know.
Yeah, I think that just proves how difficult it is. You're dealing with a resource in terms of the coastal area that's hugely valued by people, but then you also have private properties that are hugely valued as well, alongside climate change and those natural events that we can't control. There is no easy answer.
I just want to
And
go
it
back
is
to your
complicated.
principles that you started off with. You said that, that each generation should be paying, and I wonder if that's the right principle that needs to be applied here. I also wonder about your principle of affordability. You said that it would mean that everybody's still paying the same rate. Well, that's not really addressing the inequities of affordability. I think the roading one is great, but as Gray pointed out with the infrastructure, you know, we're not part of water supply, we're stormwater or wastewater. So, you know, I think there are some big questions that need to be.
Yeah, please put your feedback in. Yeah, council needs the information from the community and those views to inform their decision making. So these are proposals at the moment, and what council ultimately decides to do or not to is informed by your feedback.
Can I just answer one of your things you raised? Is we talked about, you know, how the principle of affordability, and you said, okay, that seems to be contrary to the fixed rate. You're right, it is. And so that was the whole principle. We've got in our region in two areas where the affordability across the whole district, which is driven by what we call the uniform annual general charge. But there's a second affordability within the city. And most of that is driven by the reticulated services, the fixed rate. So a property, say at Elgin, will be paying the same things that could be, say as a retirement village, which may have 150 units in terms of the same charges. So that's one of the things when we were talking about that fixed rates, how have we got to that and what are we looking at to change that principle of spreading that. So the whole point of that principle of ability to pay was trying to address some of the fixed rates that we actually do have within our rating system.
Is the aquifer being funded by the general rate or a targeted rate?
At the moment, is mostly funded external funding. So that
That's
means
because-
nobody, that's because we've external grant funded being given towards the trials and things like that. So it's injection, if you like, of money into the area and not the ratepayer is paying for it at all.
That's for this year.
The amount of things, I think,
So the trial's been funded primarily by central government, in particular MPI have put the seed funding into that. any ongoing taking it further forward is looking at a whole range of different funding models around user pays, who's going to be subsidising how that operation works. It also depends on who's going to be owning and running that model for that Makoti Aquifer recharge as well. So there's a whole range of different things around who's benefiting from it, who's paying for it, who gets to charge for it, who gets to pick the water allocations. All of those things have got to go through.
It's not a PhD, is it? Is someone doing a PhD? They're not. It's got PhD written all over it. Interesting. So when can we find out where that future funding is going to be coming from? Will that be?
We're at stage 2 of the trial now. Stage 3 will be this summer, which will then show exactly how well it's working. And the first 2 years have gone really well. We have had a couple of issues. They're looking to make some tweaks this year, and that's when we'll be looking at what that funding model is going to look like. And then the allocation, the ownership, and those discussions are happening over the sort of next 12 to 18 months. Provisional on the trial, still carrying on the way that it is.
And another 5 access points being built.
Yeah, it's interesting the amount of beds that we need to inject into, but then also the takes and the different positions along the Waipawa and the clarity of water depending on where we take it from and all of those things. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that rolls out after this summer.
I'm very interested. Thank you.
Any more questions? Are there any questions online, Mary? Okay, well, we're actually ahead of time. So on behalf of the team here and the council, just really like to thank you for coming tonight, asking your questions, giving the feedback. And like I said, really do urge you to put your submissions in. Joe mentioned, you know, they will go towards the councillors to help with their informed decision. Also, we do have some copies here, but if you want some bedtime reading, on the Let's Talk Rates website, it's a repository for quite a bit of information. It does have the statement of a proposal, and within that document, it outlines not just these proposed changes that we're taking out to the community for feedback on, but the other options that have been looked at as part of that review. And you can read about the advantages and disadvantages of those. So it is quite a comprehensive document, if rates is your thing. So there's also a link on there where you can make your submission, or again, before you leave tonight, grab one of the tablets or PCs and we can do that on the spot for you this evening. Consultation on Let's Talk Rates on the proposed rate changes. It closes on Wednesday, the 14th of October at 5 o'clock. So we need to hear your feedback by then, with hearings then being held in early November. So if you want to have speak to what you've put in your submission feedback, just tick the box and we will contact you and invite you along to one of those hearings. In terms of next steps for this review process, when would you hear back what's happening? Are the proposed changes adopted or not? We anticipate by the end of the year. That's the timeline, I think, by the end of this year. And any changes that are adopted would then be rolled out in the rates from July 2021. So I'll then ask Ree to say mihi to close us off. Yes, no? Okay, fine.
I was just going to say that there is on the website, if you are looking at it, and you may have not, but there is a rates tool. And you go onto the website and you can see the impacts. You can see, and it's based on your current rates that you actually have 2019-20, and it says there, but for these changes, what does it look like? It doesn't take into account what we may go through for the long-term plan, if there's increased and changes of budgets or your valuation increases more than somebody else's. It's solely showing the impacts of those changes that we're saying with the rates. So definitely, it's very, very easy to use. And if you want to even look at it before you go, so they can show you what it is, we can take it through it there. So other than that, on behalf of the council, the speakers,
Thanks very much. You're welcome to stay for a cuppa, make a submission, check out the rates tool. Otherwise, I'll wish you a good night and haere rā.